Good evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world today, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Shisi. I'm one of the two hosts of this week-long COVID-19 residency. And we have two really interesting writers tonight, both in Asia. So we have Chris Sung in Hong Kong and Paul Rozario-Falcone in Singapore. So I'll just introduce them briefly. So Chris is a very exciting, interesting poet, translator, and editor who's based in Hong Kong. And I have, seen his work and followed his work from a long time ago. He's already got 4 collections of poetry and many volumes of poetry in translation. And at the very prestigious Northside World Poetry Prize, he got an extraordinary mention in 2013. And he also got one of the 2017 Hong Kong Arts Development Council Young Writers or Young Artists Award. So he has a PhD in translation studies from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And very recently, just last year actually, he won the Haiji Poetry Award. And he's currently editor-in-chief of Voice and Verse Poetry magazine, which is an important magazine that's been around for a while that he's revamped and made more bilingual, which is an exciting development. And he's also the executive director of something that's been going on in Hong Kong for a number of years, the International Poetry Nights, which is directed by the Chinese poet Bei Dao. And Chris is the executive director of that. So welcome, Chris. It's nice to have you.
Thank you.
So our other writer is Paul Rozario-Falcone, and he describes himself as an itinerant author. I think that's probably a good description of him. And he calls both Singapore and Brooklyn home, but right now he is in Singapore. And you'll hear more about that in the piece he reads as to why he's in Singapore right now. He's one of the students in the program that I co-direct with Evan Fallenberg, which is the MFA, the International MFA, and he's pursuing a degree in fiction there. But before he came to us, he already had authored a book on the travels of the eunuch Admiral Zheng He, the Chinese man. And he was a co-founder of the Singapore Literature Festival in New York, and we have the director of that festival, Ji Leong Ko, here also. And he's now offering writing workshops through Safe Space Stories, a series that is based on the Amherst Writers and Artists method, which is a long-standing program. So welcome, you two. I'll just give a hand to both of you since we can't really do this in any way. So both of you are writing a very deeply personal work, actually, in both these pieces you've submitted, but you've transformed them into art, and they also seem to connect to sort of larger geopolitical issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Paul to read his piece first. Paul had a number of experiences very directly involved with COVID-19. So that's one of the reasons we invited him to be part of this, because we thought he would have something interesting to say, and he does. So Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Shu. I actually had a date that evening. A handsome waiter from a few meals the week before had looked me up on Facebook and sent a friend request. He knew I was a new widower and wanted to show me some of the gay spots in Lisbon. I said yes, because I thought it was such a sweet thing to do. It showed he cared. So the plan was dinner with friends, followed by a solo trip to meet him. But during dinner, I started feeling anxious and unwell and decided that I would simply return to the hotel. My date was disappointed, but I knew something was not quite right with me, and I would not have enjoyed myself had I gone on to meet him. Something told me to take my temperature when I returned to my hotel room, 101.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuck. I sent a message to the group of wonderful writers with whom I had just spent a week in the beautiful Belaine quarter of the city. One of the group texted back immediately and said that she too had a fever. This sent the group into a flurry of messages about symptoms and monitoring. I knew I had to get myself tested, but where? How? I called the hotel front desk, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 gentlemen in full hazmat suits appeared outside my room to escort me to the Santa Maria Hospital. Along the way, the ambulance staff chatted to me about Pessoa and Saramago, and I was delightfully distracted from my fears. At the hospital, I was taken to a tent outside the building and placed in a section cordoned off by canvas flaps, but still open to the elements. It was cold when the wind blew in. Staff came to swab my nose and throat, the first of 4 tests I would do over the next 10 days in 2 countries at 2 different hospitals. My fever continued to rise and fall with the paracetamol I was taking. A chest x-ray and blood test followed, both clear. As night gave way to dawn, more and more people arrived in the tent, most coughing up a storm. Lisbon had had, until a few days ago, very few cases. But now there was an explosion of infections and the city was bracing itself. 12 hours later, I thought I might have to stay the night, sleeping in an upright position and feeling cold, scared, vulnerable. Fortunately, because the blood work and chest x-ray came back negative, the doctors said I would be more comfortable quarantining in my hotel room while I waited for the COVID-19 swab result. That evening, I ordered a lovely meal back at the hotel, complete with my new favorite, Portuguese Vinho Verde wine. The next few days were less lovely. Aches, pains, cold sweats, fever, and constant anxious messaging with friends and family, to the point where I had to stop looking at my phone as I was just too frightened and exhausted. Unexpectedly, the airspace between Europe and America was to close that coming weekend, and the shit show that is the US response to COVID-19 began to play out on TV screens around the world. I received frantic messages from American friends and family telling me to fly home straight away. But I was waiting for my results, which did not come until 5 days later, and only because the hotel manager had pulled strings at the hospital to get the results off a friend who worked there. I was negative, but my writer friend in Providence had tested positive. I didn't question my result. I bought 2 one-way tickets, one back to New York, where I had lived for years with my husband, a Brooklyn boy. New York, the city where I had buried my husband, a city I considered home. And another ticket I bought to Singapore, my birthplace, a place my late husband adored and one that I have mixed feelings about. The hotel manager had told me to fly out in the morning as he said they were going to close Portuguese airspace. That night, I called a friend in Brooklyn. Without skipping a beat, he said I should go to Singapore. And there I was the next morning experiencing at Portela Airport the chaos of a mini evacuation of Saigon. I was borne away from Lisbon on a plane christened the José Saramago. Even feverish, I was still able to be grateful for how things had played out. I touched down at Changi and went straight to a counter to tell them of my fever, of having been in close contact with a confirmed COVID-19 case. I was seen by medical staff within the terminal, and then they whisked me away in an ambulance via the tarmac to the National Center for Infectious Diseases. In the ambulance, I peered out at the mammoth A380 airplanes that sat silent on the tarmac, my face reflected in the ambulance windows. In the photos that I had hurriedly snapped of this surreal journey on the tarmac, my masked face is superimposed onto these silent metal creatures. That evening, I do another test, negative. I get sent home, home being my friend's spare room. When my husband was alive, she had always said that we could stay with her when visiting Singapore. So now I am with her, alone, unhusbanded not even 4 months. But I'm grateful I have shelter in a country where I can get medical attention fast. The following evening, the police arrive to issue me my quarantine papers. They take my temperature and say I need to go back to the hospital. They arrange an ambulance, the 3rd one I've been inside of in the space of a week. I stay at the hospital for 2 days and I'm tested 2 more times, negative both times. In total, I've now been tested 4 times in 2 different countries at 2 different hospitals. I've said that before, haven't I? I'm put on intravenous antibiotics and the fever finally starts to abate. I spend the next 3 weeks back at my friend's place, taking my temperature 3 times a day, reporting my whereabouts a couple of times to the authorities, going back to the hospital. I write. I try and write. And I choose to write about Italian cities suffering plague, of death and dying. I cry over losing my husband. I cannot see my friends, for we are in lockdown. 2 months later, I start getting panic attacks, and unable to understand what is going on, I start writing down all my fears. My fear of dying of a heart attack like my husband, my fear of dying before I see Italy again, my fear of dying before I see my Brooklyn home again. That night, I call the ambulance, and yet again I am in a hospital being checked out for a suspected heart attack. But all is clear. I only have gastritis. I go for an endoscopy a few weeks later. I have bacteria. I take a course of antibiotics. I am recommended statins, but I cannot take them because they remind me of my husband, Al, who had to take them 3 months before he died, in between his first heart attack and the next, which carried him off instantly. I saw him suffer through the first one. It was crushing for me. The air conditioners break down at my friend's house. I cannot write in the heat. I can't read. I can't do anything. I need to leave. My own apartment in Singapore becomes available after the tenants leave. I return to it with my dear friends in tow for support. I return to the apartment I shared with my husband during our joyous years in Singapore. I break down inside. I sob with the departing tenants, complete strangers. I sob with my neighbors who knew Al. I am bereft and I cannot live there. While looking about the apartment, I discover a sonnet that Al had written 3 years before. Sonnet number 1, December 30th, 2017, by Alphonse Falcone. When lovers die, their love with them dies too. Even famous loves must share this fate. Though monuments recall their love, it's true no passion can another emulate. Love's scope is but confined to poet's ink, as less than shadow does to form compete. For as the flames of love in both hearts shrink, all warm light's clear refraction does retreat. So love depends on creatures that have life and follows rules of all biology. Although eternal love in art is rife, its true home only is theology. This is life's function we should most revere, us tabernacles of the love we share. I cry and sob anew. My friends are dumbstruck. Al has told me in no uncertain terms to move on, but it hasn't even been 6 months and he's telling me to leave him, to abandon our love, and I'm in the deepest possible despair. I put the poem on Facebook because I cannot bear to carry this alone. Friends from around the world are in wonder at the truth of my husband's message, but I'm not ready to accept that our love for each other will shrink, retreat, die. 2 days later, I find another place to live, a place I think is neutral. The 2 homes I have are inaccessible to me. The one in Brooklyn by virtue of the chaos and disorder that prevents me from returning. The one in Singapore by virtue of the painful memory of true love lost too soon, too suddenly. But the story takes a twist. Not 1 week in my new place, my writer friend informs our group that her positive result back in March was a false positive and that she doesn't have any antibodies. This would explain my constant negative results and why no one in our group actually received a positive result, even though we had spent every waking moment with each other for a week in Lisbon. None of us knows what to think anymore. And so I am in a new space. I write from a home in a part of Singapore Al and I did not spend much time in, but I realize that I have come full circle after Al's death. I am in the neighborhood of my birth. My birth home still stands a 10-minute walk from where I am. My kindergarten turned condominium is a 5-minute walk away. My secondary school is the same distance in the opposite direction. The place where I studied French as a teenager for 6 years is close by too. I am being shown my life here from this perch, being shown the life that I had before Al, being reminded of the life that is to come without Al. Al has told me in his poem that love depends on creatures that have life and follows rules of all biology, that I still have life and love in a world where I have lost both. A former lover once told me that one can never swim twice in the exact same point of a fast-flowing river. I think of the Brooklyn that has forever changed for me with the departure of my husband, with the arrival of this virus. I think of the return to that home that looks just like it did when my husband died. I think of how I will need to walk into that space without friends and family who can hold me while I survey the remains of a life lived together, down to toothbrush, shaver, hearing aids. I don't know what the future holds anymore, and all I can do is hope that I carry on living, loving, writing, and being with the people I love, virus or no virus.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very moving account, and also for the courage to share such really personal, such a personal story. I'd like to ask Chris now to read to us. His poem is in both Chinese and English, so we've asked him if he would read it first in Chinese, which is how he wrote it, and then to read the English translation that he produced. Chris. We don't have sound from Chris right now. Okay. Okay, we do now. Thank you.
I'm going to read this poem in Cantonese first. 雨夜幽居，在空少的暴雨中醒來，玻璃窗上水痕凌亂，在光明與破碎之間，劈下一道如濕的雷電。雨屑洗刷過蒙塵的玻璃，明早窗台便可容留陽光。在間歇的靜默中想起，決定離去或留下的友人。客廳角落的檸檬樹脫落最後一片香葉，樹枝牽引尖刺纏捲，收納不安的果實。重新整理凌亂的雜物架，思緒在書架間漂浮。走回在吶喊中失落的卷尺，就可以量度不公與正義。鐵馬圍起新的廣場，兇殘的旗幟隆隆升起，狂雷伴隨新的秩序。天空潑墨時，亮出匕首。So, this is the English version. Worried about home. Woke up to an ominous rainstorm. Water traced in disarray on the glass. Between light and breakdown, strike a streak of soap angst. Rain washed the dust-laden window. Will sunlight remain tomorrow? Silence came and went. Thought of friends deciding to leave or stay. The lemon tree in the corner loosed its last redolent leaf. Spikes drew near as branches embraced the anxious fruit. Tidied up the messy sundries. Thoughts drifted among shelves. If I found a lost yardstick, could I measure the wrong sting? Mills barriers surrounded the square. A tyrant's flag rose towards the rumble. The storm befell us. With its new order, sky splashed ink and showed its dagger.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really wonderful. The feeling of the Cantonese poem and the English poem, you know, there are differences, but it's a wonderful poem in either language. So I'm going to ask you both about this question of writing about something that is deeply personal. I mean, in Chris's, we don't have a direct personal narrative in the sense that we have in Paul's, but you know, we have a lot of words that tell us about emotions, about anxiety, for example, and the chaos in your personal life, the thought of friends deciding to leave or stay. But of course, this is connected to larger questions that are going on. We can surmise in Hong Kong, where you talk about the tyrant's flag rose towards the rumble. And in Paul's piece, again, you know, well, that's clearly a very personal story he's telling and a personal chaos that he had to go through. But the background to all that, the backdrop to all that is the chaos in the world. I mean, you know, he mentions the COVID travel that made it so difficult, where nobody knew what was going on at any point, and also the connections to friends around the world, trying to find some sense of stability. So could you each talk a little bit about this, trying to write about the personal and connecting it to sort of maybe larger geopolitical events as well as larger issues going on? Chris, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the poem has a little bit of context. The poem was written after the day when the proposal of the national security law was announced. That night saw heavy rain and thunderstorm and lightning in Hong Kong. And I heard it was like the 1997 when the UK handed the sovereignty of Hong Kong to China. But on that night in June this year, I was awakened by thunder. I felt menaced. And I don't know where Hong Kong would go and where my home would be and where the future would be. And everything became more uncertain. And I tried to capture that feeling of menace and uncertainty in that poem. And through different images inside and outside the flags, and also inside and outside the mind. And the poem also mentioned the questions of living or staying in Hong Kong. I think many people who are truly, I think many people are truly considering it. And I think whoever lives in Hong Kong inherits such dilemma. And looking at the history of the city, and Hong Kong has always been in turbulence, and people here always feel an unprecedented epochal change looming overhead, and always think that and think about the question about staying or living if the options are realistically available, and always find ways to survive, resist, or even resign. So it can, and it actually, this larger kind of context connects to the idea of home and taking Hong Kong as home. And I have been moving around a few cities since I was 18 years old. But right now, I feel that my home is in Hong Kong. The home my current life attaches to and my work contributes to. It is in Hong Kong that I seriously developed my career as a poet, translator, editor, and scholar. And my work with these roles grows as the city evolves. It feels like that the city and I have been undergoing social turbulence together in the last decades. It's hard to imagine anyone who truly loves Hong Kong doesn't identify with this feeling passed down from earlier generations of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has forever changed my life, and at the same time, I understand that identity could evaporate instantly if fate brings me somewhere else. But wherever I go, I'm sure Hong Kong will always have a very special place in my heart where I can always return, and this I would call home. I'm afraid I'm stray a little bit, but my point is that although this poem has a larger context, but it really connects to the idea of a home and connects to a very personal level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Chris. What about you, Paul? You're looking at a very chaotic geopolitical situation around the world that's affected you in this piece. Yeah.
Yes, and the thing is, it's beautiful reading, Chris. I really enjoyed listening to the Cantonese especially, and what you said just now about, the piece being about finding home in the midst of all of this chaos and uncertainty that we have are experiencing at the moment. So, finding home is also something that I mentioned quite a few times in this nonfiction piece that I've just read, this idea of what is home and where is home. And, there are two different situations where I received COVID-19 tests, one in Lisbon and one in Singapore. And both times I received the test very quickly, which is very unusual. I mean, if you live in the US or in many other places, who's getting you can't get a test. And sometimes I've been told that, you have to show really severe symptoms before you can even get a test. So already, just by virtue of being a tourist going to this hospital in Portugal, I've experienced what that system has allowed me to do as a foreigner in Portugal, and then coming back to Singapore, where I am a citizen here, so I've experienced what that's like. But where in the world can we get these resources that allow us access to health quickly and safely? And this virus has really shown the discrepancy and at every level, every country has a different response to it, and that comes through, I think, in what I've experienced myself, being having been tested in 2 different countries like this. So yeah, the uncertainty is something that is plaguing pun, yeah, it's a pun, to plaguing all our lives at the moment, and we all have to figure out how to manage and how to cope. And for me, I came to writing this piece out of desperation, because I didn't know what else to do. Especially after I felt that I was going to die myself. My gastritis was very scary to me, because I didn't realize that it could make you feel that way. And the fear of dying is what kind of prompted me to actually put these things down on paper, which are it's very difficult for me to do so, because I cry when I write these things, and then when I read these things, I become very emotional. Yeah, so that's all I can do really to cope with the uncertainty now, is to try and express myself in writing. I find that it's easier for me to write about something else, which is, I think that's a lot of writers find that, rather than writing about themselves. But the truth of what we write tends to be more apparent when we write from a place of truth, rather than if we were to write something that we know of only intellectually. So I was writing about plague in Italian cities and characters affected by death, other characters, other people. I wasn't really writing about myself being affected by it, but then it came to a point where I simply had to write about how I'd been affected. Yeah, so it wasn't easy to start writing about these things, but I did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. It is interesting because you're both writing in the genres, sort of poetry and literary or creative nonfiction, which actually allow for much more personal expression. And I think the chaos that the world is experiencing has something to do with this fear of dying that you speak of, Paul. I think that we're all, on some level, we're facing this question of death every single day. So this brings me to the second point I wanted to talk to you both about and have you maybe reflect on. You may or may not be familiar with the poem by Wallace Stevens, The Idea of Order at Key West, a very famous American poem. But just the idea of order, because this is something that both your work seem to try to make sense of. You place some kind of order, whether it's in the form of the poem, the form of the nonfiction you're writing, Paul, or whether it's in the way you marry sort of certain images with the language that you're using to try to make some sense of it. I was particularly struck by the line that Chris had about he tidied up the messy sundries and thoughts drifted among shelves. You want to talk about the sense of trying to make order out of chaos that writing sort of sometimes allows us to do?
Yeah, for this particular poem, so I was writing about what actually happened that night. I woke up from the thunder, and so I was worried about Hong Kong, worried about my home, and felt that the chaos was coming over. Then so tidied up the messy sundries, and so I was just trying to escape from that thought of chaos actually, and try to make sense of life, to grasp a kind of order of life, of my life, and so but it also the next line already immediately suggests that it's to no avail, and thoughts drifted among shelves. It drifted everywhere. and so it can back to the chaos. So and in the last stanza, it says the storm befell us with his new order, and this new order might be our chaos. So I think this is all very relative, and I think the new reality, if we can call that a new reality, is order for some people, but chaos for some for others. And I think the problem and the feelings that were created by the relationship, the power relationship behind this, you know, then the one who grabs the reality as the order has more power, you know, over the people who feel this is, you know, chaos. So that there is all these imposition and overpowering and exploitation, if you will, going on there. So that's how I understand the relationship between chaos and order in relation to this particular poem.
Thank you, Chris. Paul, what about you?
Well, when you're in survival mode, you can barely think about what it is that you do and why you're doing what you're doing. You're just doing. When I first started writing the words "I am afraid of dying," that was actually a format that I used to just start thinking about why I was so scared. So every sentence I began was, "I'm afraid of dying before something. I'm afraid of dying before." So I used that, those 4 words, and I kept writing the same, kept writing this, whatever I was afraid of, why I was afraid of dying, over and over again. So there was a certain order in the way my brain was trying to be precise about specifically what it was I was afraid of. Because it came to a point where I was terrified of everything, and my body was and mind was just breaking down. So I realized I needed to have some order, even in that chaos. I needed to like put down an order to the way I was thinking. And that allowed me to start looking at everything that had happened to me in the last 3 months, in the last 4 months, and to sort of then structure my experiences and write about it in this format, in this, in the narrative that you just heard. So my brain really and my heart really just got to a stage where I had to construct an order for myself. Otherwise, I just don't know what would have happened. But I'm glad I did, because it meant that I was true to how it was that I was feeling.
Mm-hmm. You both have mentioned this idea of being true to, the experience, to the emotions, to what was actually happening. Because in both pieces, very much about the moment of what is happening. But of course, writing is an art form where you step back and you reflect. I wanted to come back to this idea of home, because home carries a lot of trauma in both of these pieces. Paul is sort of trying to figure out where to live, and the homes that he has known because of the death of his husband has been, sort of not available to him in a way. It's too traumatic to go there. And the title of Chris's poem is Worried About Home. So home embraces this worry, and it might go on for quite a while, because as your friends leave or stay, as you try to decide, do I leave, do I stay, what do I do, where do I go? And you mentioned also that if you go somewhere else, you have to negotiate a new identity again, when you have a very strong identity with this place. So would you both talk a little bit more about home and the sort of traumatic side of it? Because trauma in writing is something that happens a lot, something that we all have to deal with on some level. Mm-hmm. Whoever wants to start?
I can go. Yeah, I have had many, many, many homes in my life. Every time I have left Singapore for another country, I've had to create a different home. I have homes that I come back to, but each time I go to a different home, it means saying goodbye to the home that I'm leaving. My husband and I always felt very sad to leave wherever we were, whether it was Singapore or Brooklyn or Italy, because we really felt at home in all three places. But I suspect the reason we felt at home in all three places is because we were home to each other. So through my husband, I learned that being home is really not just a physical space, but you can be home with people and loved ones and friends. So home is just not just a physical space, but it's also an emotional, spiritual place. And that lack of home from that sense is even more devastating than not having a physical home in many ways. Yeah, so for me, there's home. There are the houses that I kind of travel between, and then there is the home that I lost when my husband died. I don't have any emotional home anymore, and that can be just as kind of upsetting as not having shelter, or even more upsetting than maybe not having shelter over your head. So that my notion of home has never been any concrete, and will never be concrete in the sense of a physical place. But it's writing allows me to explore how home for me is just I don't know, it's a four-letter word, but I'm still working out what that means to me, basically.
Thank you, Paul. Chris, you mentioned you've been moving around since you're 18, so you also understand this transnational or multiple spaces of home. You want to talk a little bit about home and the trauma of home?
Yeah, I left my hometown. I grew up in Guangdong province, which is very near Hong Kong. So I left my hometown when I was 18 and went to study in another city in Guangdong. And after that, I went to Macau for a few years. And after Macau, I came to Hong Kong. But I've been working and living in Hong Kong for the past 10 years. And I could say that Hong Kong has been my most stable home so far. And the traumatic side of it, I think, is that as I so emotionally attached to the city, and I kind of inherit the kind of unstable feeling of the city, I guess, because Hong Kong's always been very unstable. Well, ever since 1949, people moved to Hong Kong and moved out of Hong Kong whenever big political change happened. So people are thinking about saying or leaving, and so I was kind of surprised that I think of Hong Kong as a very stable home, because all this history about Hong Kong, especially my scholarly research is about that, the history of Hong Kong literature written by people coming to Hong Kong and leaving Hong Kong. So I think if there is a trauma, the trauma is that unstableness of Hong Kong. And I have been written quite some poems about that. Not only this worried about home, this poem that I am discussing and sharing tonight, but also a whole lot other poems about to explore what is home for me. But 2 years ago, I met my future wife, and she's now applying for jobs overseas and all over the world. So I will probably follow her everywhere. But so I quite agree with what Paul said. you know, your home, emotional home, is where your love is.
Yes, certainly. This is both these works have given us a lot of food for thought about the concept of home. I'd like to turn for a little while just to something a little different about the question of language. Well, Chris, of course, you are, you're clearly bilingual in English and Chinese, or Cantonese, and I assume also Putonghua, Mandarin. And Paul, I know that you speak a number of languages and actually feel, I think, probably in a number of languages. Do you want to talk a little bit about this sort of multilingual sort of what it does for you as a writer? And today you both shared English language work, and Chris also a Cantonese language one. But what does it do to your head as a writer when these different languages sort of mill around there and collide, I suppose, at times?
So yeah, I'll go first.
Okay.
I think my bilingual writing practice is very much combined with translation. Since I started translating poetry maybe 10 years ago, I have also grown the habits of writing in both Chinese and English. When I create a poem in one language, I just couldn't help trying to translate it into the other language. But translating my own writing has been a very difficult experience. But well, I think it's a problem of a translator having too much poetic license. As for difficulty in self-translation, I find it very hard to resist the temptation to rewrite the poem in the target language. So you'll find that the discrepancies between the Chinese and English versions that I just read, it usually resulted in rewriting the original as well because of the translation. So the cycle goes on and on as such. So it's constantly rewriting. So the reciprocation has turned out to be a very rewarding dialogic kind of creative process. And I really like that. and at the same time, it makes self-translation also very difficult because I have translated lots of poetry. I seem to grow an unconscious habit of producing poems that are difficult to translate, especially in the direction from Chinese to English. And the poems are not so difficult to read, but the multi-layering density of metaphorical imagery and also the poetic language induces to ambiguity, make them very difficult to translate. Then when I find it too difficult, I just pass the job to my translator friends, and most often Lucas Klein and Tammy here. So speaking of the poetic language, when I write in Chinese, I tend to remove some prepositions, conjunctions, and some function words. And then the removal reveals immense possibility of the spatial relationship among the images. So because we in Chinese, if you remove the characters or words like before or in front of, so in Chinese you can do that. But in English, I think you can't. And the removal, such kind of removal of function words enriches the interpretation to create some kind of imagistic ambiguity that evokes a sense of like classical Chinese words at both rhythmic and semantic levels. So I think so far, bilingual writing has posed me a lot of difficulties. So that's how I felt. But in the meantime, it's also very rewarding, and I enjoy that process.
I love what you say about how you find yourself writing Chinese poems that are difficult to translate. I think it's true because as far as wanting to rewrite, I can give two examples. Lin Yutai, who was the daughter of Lin Yutong, she wrote a novel first in English, and then there's also a Chinese version. And then you just read the first pages of both. You see that she has completely rewritten the novel. And similarly, Eileen Chang, Lust Caution, her very famous work, she wrote it originally as an English language story, and the two are completely different. And it's quite astonishing. I think the Chinese version in the end is the more successful one. And I think that's why she chose to just do it that way. Yeah. And of course, she was somebody who was quite bilingual. But Paul, what about you? Tell people too about your many languages, because you really do have quite a few.
Well, I do. I have learned many languages and I speak a bunch of them. So I speak, I learned Chinese in school, so I speak Mandarin, and I speak French. I'm learning Italian. I also speak Amharic, a little bit of Amharic, which is one of the major language in Ethiopia. And I grew up listening to Malayalam, which is my mother tongue, the language of my ancestors. Now, because I am a linguist in the sense that I speak these languages, I'm constantly attuned to the sound of these languages. And how beautiful all of these languages sound. So for me, language is very much a spoken thing. And so the relationship I have with these languages in writing and in written form is quite different, because different in the sense that when I'm reading them, I don't necessarily think about the sound. And what's happening when I read in these languages is my brain is doing the translating. So it becomes very technical when I'm reading, and I find that writing in these languages, I do not have the technical facility yet to write in. Maybe I can. I have written in French. I've written, poetry in French. But I feel like a lot of people have written poetry in French. The moment you feel as if you can write things down in French, you do, because it sounds so pretty. So me writing in these languages is a little bit far off. However, I do have a goal of learning to write write literary fiction in Italian, only because it's just it's just a language I kind of have an affinity for emotionally. These languages inform my writing very much in terms of setting and character, and how people speak. So, I do think of, say, Ethiopian characters speaking in Amharic, or Ethiopian characters speaking in Italian, or French characters speaking in Mandarin. I do think of that because I'm like that. All of these languages that I know better than my own mother tongue. So I'm always a brown person speaking English or French or Chinese or Italian or Amharic. I'm not from those languages, but I speak them. I have a facility for them, and I can understand, and people can understand me. So the kinds of characters I create are those characters. Or the kinds of characters that I'm hoping to create are those characters.
That's fascinating. I think, well, you're in good company if you want to write in Italian, because Jumpala Hiri does, and she, like Chris, gives her Italian to somebody else to translate, just like Chris gives his Chinese poem to somebody else to translate. That's wonderful. I mean, very much one of the impetus behind this virtual week is, for the Mongrel Writers Residence, my goal with starting this private writers residence is to honor and to try to celebrate the kind of writing that is transnational, that's transcultural, that's translingual, because I think our global world is very much like that. Very few people remain in one place their entire lives. I'm very envious of people who can do that, but I've known very, very few people who do. So that's the truth of it. So just before we close, I'm going to ask you the thing that Tammy and I agreed that we should try to get everybody to talk a little bit about, because the theme for this week was the writing life beyond COVID. And both of you show us a little bit of that in your work. And I think more directly, Paul did by talking about, the hope that you can carry on living, loving writing, and being with people you love virus or no virus. It's almost like, although COVID-19 was sort of like maybe the prompt to write some of this, it's dismissed. It's the thing that doesn't matter. And I thought the line in Chris's poem that really was quite beautiful: would sunlight remain tomorrow? I mean, how we think, because nature is quite important in your poem because of the storm that happens. And so I really like that image and that question that you pose to the reader. So just take it away. Tell us what the writing life beyond COVID-19 looks like to both of you, and maybe to the world, how you see it for the rest of us.
Well, I'll start. I'm gonna just say that for me, the last two lines of the sonnet that my husband Alphonse Falcone wrote, I think for me they're really a beacon and an instruction on how to live. So he says, "This is life's function we should most revere, us tabernacles of the love we share." So it's all of us responding to the love that we have in each of us, to the love that is present in the rest of us. So it's just person to person connecting and just being and recognizing the love that we have for each other.
That's very beautiful. What about you, Chris?
Yeah. Well, during the COVID time, I think I write more poems than before the COVID time, and simply because I kind of half self-quarantined at home, and and if I'm not doing my work, then I would be writing, and so it's either poems or more recently prose writing. So I'm still very much into this COVID writing. So it's still not beyond. I hope I will on that as soon as possible. Actually, I recently started a series of diary kind of entries, and I started as some kind of notes from my daily walk from Wan Chai to the central the central seaside promenade, and so I note down what I see on the streets. So it was actually for my parents who are living in mainland China, and they like to learn about the environments that I'm living in. So it sort of started like that. So and I posted on Facebook, and people seem to like it. And Tammy kindly translate them into English and post them on Cha. And so I'm still very much into this COVID writing, and I seldom write prose. And it's kind of like a new toy, so I'm still very much into it. Yeah. And speaking of prose writing, can I ask a question? Can I ask Paul? Yeah. So when I was reading Paul's When Love Dies, I was really impressed. I found that there are like two distinct sets of narratives. On the one hand, you're dealing with the loss of your husband and starting to recover from support. And on the other hand, you are facing the COVID-19 situation, right? The hotel, the test, the flights, the flats, and all that. The two sets of narratives have distinct feelings. And when I was reading, I couldn't help keeping wondering, if I were to write a poem about two sets of narratives loaded with such strong emotions and feelings, I would probably have a collage of fragmentary images, written with intentionally broken syntax, kind of like that. Very modernist. But when I read your prose, I was amazed how smoothly the two sets of narratives come together and how well the feelings of loss of love and the feeling of uncertain situation related to the COVID-19, blend into each other. I don't usually write prose, but I would call it your magic of prose writing. It was fantastic reading experience. So I'm curious, what was your strategy of structuring this and writing this?
Yeah, I don't think I consciously had a strategy until I literally had that moment that I was telling you about, where I had to write down in a very specific way all my fear of dying and why I was scared. When I wrote that, then everything that I knew what I had to write before, and I knew what I had to write after.
Mm.
And that's that one point where I think I confronted myself, and then I had to write. I just had to write. There was nothing else I could do. If I hadn't written, I don't know what would have happened. I keep saying that. But so the structure did not come as something that I had pre-planned. It came from a moment, a realization of self and a realization of truth. And from that moment, it went back in time and it then went forward in time also. So there was this one pivotal moment. And I think in a lot of fabulous fiction and nonfiction, there are these points throughout the story that they start as individual points that may be separated, but suddenly you find how they all connect, and then the story happens. It does, because you've joined these seemingly disparate experiences, but each point has this profound truth where a character realizes something, or two people connect in a certain way, or there is some kind of immense loss or joy. And they're discrete events when you're writing about them, but because they contain this truth, the writer in you then realizes how to connect these discrete stories, and that's when the narrative just kind of happens.
Oh.
Thank you, Paul. That's like a lecture on how to make a narrative flow and connect different ideas, different emotions, different stories as well. So that's wonderful. Well, we're out of time, I'm afraid, at this point. So I just want to first of all say thank you again to both Chris and Paul. Thank you very much for your contributions tonight, and just mention that tomorrow morning we will be Tammy will be moderating a talk with Tan Lai-Kun and Jake Edelstein. So we'll have somebody in Hong Kong and somebody in California. So we had to make the time, work for both of them. So it's Tammy, I believe it's 11 o'clock in the morning. Is that right? In Hong Kong.
11 o'clock.
Yeah. Okay, so do sign in again for that tomorrow. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you again, Chris and Paul, for your contribution. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Tamara, Tammy. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.